So the days come that many of you have anticipated. Pastor Harry's preaching. Especially the choir. I have a confession to make. I'm a nerd. I'm a church nerd. I love being in church. I've always loved being in church. I grew up in church. My mother was a junior choir director and sang in the choir, so on Tuesday night prayer meeting, and choir was afterwards, I would sit there and listen to them. On the side, I started taking piano lessons when I was 5 years old. And so during choir, I would sit on the organist's bench because I was so fascinated by this instrument that had 2 keyboards and pedals. Well, my feet couldn't reach the pedals. But anyway, that's how I grew up in church. I grew up in an EUB church, so I had no background in a liturgical church. As liturgical as we got was Christmas Eve. We had great celebrations on Christmas Eve. I later found liturgical church. My best friend in high school was Catholic, so I would go to church with him often. In fact, I would play the organ there sometimes. I loved liturgy, but it was Catholic. Well, then I met someone who was Lutheran, and it was like the angels sang, God sang in glory and said, here it is, a Protestant liturgical church. And that's where I've been ever since. Well, I did come over to the Episcopals when I saw the light, eventually. But here we are. That's my confession. So today, we mark a transition in the church year. We're moving from Epiphany into Lent. What exactly is Epiphany? Well, according to a dictionary definition, it's a sudden intuitive perception of or insight into the reality or essential meaning of something, usually initiated by some simple, homely, or commonplace occurrence or experience. How do you like that definition? And from Wikipedia, an epiphany, not necessarily a religious epiphany, but epiphany is a moment of clarity or revelation that is triggered by a person, object, or situation. The word has Greek origins. It originally meant to manifest or to show. In our Christian lives, epiphany is a moment of revelation or manifestation. We use that word a lot, don't we? Manifest. Particularly when referring to the birth of and early years in the life of Jesus. The word comes from Greek epiphaneia, which means to show or manifestation. Epiphany, as we have witnessed the last 2 months, celebrates 4 important events in Jesus' life, beginning with the star in the east, guiding the Magi to Jesus. Then we have Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River, then his first miracle at the wedding of Cana, and today, Jesus' transfiguration on a mountain. Jesus' transfiguration is where we find ourselves, and Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. He did that a lot, I think. He prayed, but he also went up the mountain a lot. I think it was to get away from the crowds. Haven't we all had that feeling? Wanting to get away from the crowds and the craziness. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. A cloud came and overshadowed him. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." I think that's one of the most wonderful sayings in the Bible, although in Mark and others it says, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased." And I love that word, beloved. Isn't it wonderful to know that we are the beloved of God? Luke isn't the only one who tells this story. Matthew and Mark include it in their telling, and Peter actually tells of it from firsthand experience in 2 Peter. I don't know if many of you are aware, there's a thing called, or a theory, called the Book of Q, or the missing book of the Bible, Q. We we're sure, well, the experts are sure that this book existed, but it's been lost to history. And the reason they think it happened, was, or occurred, or existed, was that from it came a lot of the gospel stories that we hear in the readings that we use in the church. And this is one of them. There are 3 instances of this particular event in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, plus the additional story in 2 Peter. So we're sure this happened. This amazing transfiguration happened. It also happened another time, if you remember, his baptism. He goes into the water, and as he comes up, a voice sounding like thunder said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Now, in this story, in Luke, we add, "Listen to him." This is a time of transformation, transfiguration, both for Jesus and the disciples. Before today's trip up the mountain, Jesus told the disciples that he is to suffer and die and be raised up on the 3rd day. And up until this mountaintop experience, I'm not sure the disciples fully grasped what Jesus was telling them. But seeing Jesus transfigured and standing there with Moses and Elijah and hearing the voice of God had to be transforming, an epiphany, if you will. I don't know about you, but I've had a few epiphanies in my life, some that are so profound that I will never forget them. Mountaintop experiences. One was when I was 6 years old. I grew up in an EUB church, as I've mentioned before, and we didn't have confirmation. We had an altar call. And in this call, usually at the end of a service, and they're singing "Just As I Am," without one plea. We were invited by the pastor to come forward if we want to dedicate our lives to Jesus, basically. I didn't hear about God for a long time. I heard about Jesus and dedicating your life to him. Well, at 6 years old, and being very shy, because by 6 years old, I had been hospitalized 3 times. And my parents told me that after my first one, I had been, before that, a very outgoing child. But after that, I wouldn't. I was very shy, clung to my parents. And so for this shy 6-year-old to walk out from the pew and go down an aisle, which I swear was a mile long, but this church I grew up in wasn't much bigger than this chapel. It looked like a long way. I went down there, but all the time I felt a presence. The second time was when I was in my 20s. After a decade or so of being very confused about my place in society and the church because of my sexuality, I don't exactly remember what happened, but suddenly I felt God telling me that I was perfectly made just the way I was. It was a very profound moment. It was a God in my face moment. It didn't necessarily make life easier. It made life more bearable because I knew in God's eyes I was good the way I was. Next transforming moment was when I looked in the eyes of my beloved spouse. Now, I don't know if all of you had this experience, but we had crossed paths a few times. But this time, we're going out on a date. And he opened the door, I looked in his eyes, and 43 years later, God was right. God let me know. The next really profound time was when that beloved was given a diagnosis of a fatal disease. At that time, it was fatal. it turned out that medicine came through. Discoveries happened, and that it didn't happen. But what it did have to do was make me profoundly aware that God was there and helped me through the next 2 times he had diagnosis of a potentially fatal colon cancer diagnosis. That second and third time wasn't nearly as profound because I'd already gone through it the first time. So I believe in being transformed and transfigured. I believe we can be transformed by listening to God's beloved holy child. And what is beloved telling us? Well, let's hear what we've heard the last few months. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. Listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If when anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other. Anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold your shirt. Love your enemies. Do good and lend. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. I believe the most simple yet most profound words that Jesus spoke are these when questioned as to what the greatest commandment is. In my church in Chicago, where I did weekly mass, I always began the service with this. And this is what Jesus said. Love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So there we have 3 great commandments. Love God, love neighbor, and love yourself, which is probably the hardest part of all of our lives, learning to love ourselves. Because if we don't, we can't love our neighbor. And I'm not sure we can love God, truly, if we don't love ourselves. These things, my friends, are what we can take with us as we leave the Epiphany season and go into Lent. The season, Epiphany is the season of light, and Lent, a season of reflection and renewal. Love God, love your neighbor, love yourselves, be merciful, forgive others, and most of all, remember, Christ is the beloved of God. Listen to him.